Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. My guest today is Mike McGetrick, Vice President at Sparks 451, a Jenzabar company. Mike has been in marketing and communications for more than 25 years, and not only has he been in traditional industry, he's also worked at multiple institutions, including New York University, where he teaches digital marketing. Today's topic is going to be Marketing 301, Advanced Marketing Skills for Higher Education, and we'll take that into a second episode where we'll be talking specifically about enrollment marketing. Mike, welcome to the show.
Drumm, it's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am as well. You've been doing this marketing and higher ed stuff, especially enrollment management, for many, many years. Grace our listeners with a bit of your background, if you would, please, sir.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, just a bit about my background. I'm a creative professional by training. I'm a marketer by profession, and I'm an educator by passion. So, really more than 25 years, I've worked at the intersection of telling stories, applying technology, and using measurable performance in marketing. And where I am right now at Spark 451, a company I founded, we help colleges and universities really dive deep into their institutional mission and connect it to the realities of their enrollment environments, how students discover them, evaluate them, choose them, and ultimately succeed in their programs. I mentioned that I teach, and for me, it keeps me close to the student experience. And it's difficult to talk abstractly about higher education when you're in a classroom every week watching students try to connect what they're learning to the lives that we want to build. And that's the passion that keeps me alive and keeps me energized to keep doing what I'm doing.
That's neat. I can remember my days back in the classroom, and it was always a blast, always. Just seeing people transforming in front of you and learning concepts, being able to put A plus B equals C and maybe even D and E. To me, that was very fulfilling.
Yeah, totally. Another thing is, when you have an opportunity to directly help someone, let's say, I have a lot of, in addition to being in the classroom, I have a lot of industry connections, a lot of marketing industry connections, and I'm based in New York. So a lot of my students have really founded companies, and a lot of my former coworkers are in positions of power where they can help employ students. So I'm always connecting students with internships, with jobs, and to see them succeed down the line is incredibly rewarding. I'll just say that, and I'm sure that every educator shares the same feeling. That's one of the most rewarding things in life, to see the people that you've had contact with and influence succeed in life. So it's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. And we've all got stories like that. I want to jump into higher ed right now. And, my listeners and everybody else has heard all the problems with higher ed, whether it be political, the cost of education, the student debt, demographic cliffs, enrollments. To me, it boils down to there's a lot of things broken, but how do we get that good message for higher ed out here? And does it really come down to good old-fashioned marketing to deal with the enrollment process, the marketing enrollment process?
Yeah, well, first, let's talk about some of the pressures you alluded to, right? I don't think higher education has one crisis, really. It's got a bunch, right? I would kind of boil them down to three pressures that have kind of arrived almost simultaneously. The first is the demographic pressure, right? College-age populations diminishing as a result of the 2008 fiscal crisis we had here in the U.S., and where the birth rate dropped significantly. And we had our peak in 2025 graduating class, and we have projection to go down 15% over the next 10 years or so. So things are dropping.
Right.
We've got economic pressures, families asking hard questions about price, about student debt, time to completion, what kind of outcomes they're getting out of college educations.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've sort of this crisis of confidence, right? Higher education has allowed other people to define where its value lies, right? We have politicians chiming in, we have college rankings, we have social media pundits putting out isolated anecdotes and things and kind of like diminishing the value of it. And so higher education doesn't simply have an enrollment problem or a marketing problem. It's got a confidence and clarity problem. And I think there's a lot of things going on. So, does it come down to your question of good old-fashioned marketing? I would say to a certain degree, yes, but not if we define marketing as advertising. Good marketing.
Very different.
Yeah. Good marketing begins before the so-called campaign.
You put it in an interesting way. We've allowed others to define what higher education is. That to me is a communications issue, isn't it?
I would say it definitely has. There's, colleges to a certain degree have become symbols in political arguments that are often partly about education. And institutions shouldn't respond by becoming louder versions of the critics, but rather they should respond by being more transparent about what their missions are, who they serve, the kinds of things that they teach, and what it really costs to make that happen. And of course, what happens to their graduates. So yes, all those are communication issues that, need to be brought to the top of the conversation for sure.
Mm-hmm. And my next guest following you is a crisis communications expert who's going to talk about all these things, including how communications has changed in the last years. But the college and university marketing have changed significantly in the past few years. Gone are the days of billboards on the side of the road.
Yes. I mean, I won't say there's no place for those billboards, because if you're in higher ed, you know that your board is going to ask you, well, this college that we know of has billboards on the side of the road, and I see them every day when I'm driving to work. Why don't we have billboards? You're going to hear that. I think that the enrollment process has become less like a traditional marketing funnel and more like prolonged risk assessment, right? I always like to start with the audience, right? Mm-hmm. What is the audience asking, right? Students are asking, can I afford this? Will I belong at this place? Can I be successful at this program? What opportunities are going to create in my life? How does it compare to the alternatives that are available to me? And believe me, they're looking at a lot of alternatives with students applying to 12 or more schools. And can I really trust the institution, what it's telling me, right? And I think an important point to take away from this for the audience is admissions used to be principally about evaluating the student, right? Getting an application. Are they admissible? Will they fit here? Will they be successful here? And it's more increasingly about how the student is evaluating the institution. And there's a lot of stuff going on there. So the biggest competitor may not always be another college. It may be an alternative, right? It might be postponement. It might be a training. It might be some alternative to going to college, going to trade school, going into the trades. So there's a lot to evaluate there for the student and a lot for the school to address for sure.
I can remember teaching in our school's MBA program, and the big thing was the 4 Ps of marketing: product, price, placement, and promotion. Now, you've got one of those for higher ed, but it's a little different than just that. Please enlighten us.
Yeah, sure. The 4 Ps originated by Philip Kotler, as you alluded to. Over time, we've created our own adaptation at Spark 451. We say it's product and positioning. What is the school offering and why should the market care? How are they positioned relative to their competitors? Personas, who are they serving? What's happening in their lives when they make this decision? Platforms, where and how do students encounter, research, and engage with the institution? And finally, performance. What measurable behavior and institutional outcomes did the work produce? So it's a slightly different take on it, but I think, as those who work in higher education know that there's a lot of specificity to our industry and a lot of nuance, and it deserves its own set of P's, if you will, Drumm.
Mhm. And I'm curious because one of the big ones in the traditional 4 Ps of marketing is price, but I didn't hear you mention anything about that. Why or why not?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. First is that we embed the price typically in the positioning, which is our competitive analysis. But second, I left it out partly because higher education itself so often leaves price out. Institutions treat price as, the financial aid office's responsibility, but students don't, right?
Mhm.
Price absolutely belongs in the strategy, but the complication is that higher education has a sticker price and then an individualized net price, and then maybe what's a perceived price by the audience. And the marketing must help families understand all three of those things. And at present, it's very rare that they don't. Colleges know their sticker price. Students need to know their likely price and what that investment is going to likely make possible for them.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more institutions have a page on pricing, the average scholarship awarded, et cetera. But not all of them do that. And that's challenging. And I think that lends to part of the value crisis that higher ed is seeing right now is you see a sticker price. I mean, there are 16 colleges last I saw that have a sticker price of over $100,000 per year. Now, are students paying that? No, of course not. But they don't understand that. And that first sticker price, when somebody goes up to a website and sees even 50,000 a year and their parents are making 40,000 a year, something like that, they immediately go, oh, light switch off. Not going to do that because we can't afford that. And I can't afford to get in debt to do that.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the big challenges, Drum. And when you look at a college's Google Analytics from their website, there's a particular KPI called exit pages. And when you look at your tuition page, if your exit page, meaning the last page students looked at, if that's the biggest exit page on your website, then you probably have a challenge, right? You have a sticker price that's scaring people off. And so that's when you need to do something a little bit better about communicating. And I think colleges have over time, done a better job of that and are publishing the average amount that a family pays at their school. And I think that's a good way to look at it. Certainly some students will always pay the full amount. Some students will pay very little based on a number of factors. What's the average amount? And I think that's something that a family can get comfortable with at the initial discovery phase. You don't want to scare them off at the discovery phase, right? You want to have them remain interested so that you can have opportunities to communicate value to them. And so value comes in lots of forms, but if they can't hear your full story and they get scared off right away, that's going to be a problem. So price opacity, I think the big takeaway is, it might help an institution get an application, but it can definitely cost them in trust over time.
Yeah. The transparency is the key with this so people can understand. There's many colleges that have come out recently and said, if your parents are making $200,000 or less during a year, your tuition is going to be free. Now that's something obviously that needs to be on your pricing webpage. But at the same time, $200,000 a year is a pretty good chunk of money for most families. Are you going to get there? And what is what's the word I'm looking for? How exclusive are your enrollment processes? Is it an open enrollment? I would bet not for something like that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you looked at most of those institutions that are offering free tuition for students under a certain income. They are typically the most elite colleges that we have in our country, right? And so there's a whole bunch of factors that can go into that. And if you can make those institutions work, look, is it a good thing? Of course. If you're capable of making it into those institutions and cost was going to hold you back from entering the highest ranks of academia, then it's a good thing that they've eliminated that. But that serves a very small percentage of the incoming student population, right? And then, of course, there's sort of suggestive statistics that say that there are a high percentage of the students who go to those institutions or their families are making much more than $200,000. The academic success is in some ways correlated with family income, and studies of the SATs have demonstrated that over time as well. So, yes, that's a wonderful thing for those institutions to be doing, but A, can they open their doors to more students? And B, can we find other ways to make that kind of promise possible for other mid-sized institutions and other non-elite schools without those huge endowments that can help them fund those?
So basically we've been talking about the 4 Ps and how they relate to marketing. Branding is part of marketing, really institutional reputation, whether it be outcomes, the KPIs that we talked about a little bit ago. What are you seeing for big issues in higher ed branding right now?
So also a very interesting topic and something that's very close to my heart. Branding, of course, hasn't always been on the minds of higher education leaders, and in some ways can be an afterthought, right? But to address your question, I think there are a few problems that I see. The first and perhaps most visible one is institutional sameness. Too many colleges describe themselves with the same collection of phrases, right? We have world-class faculty, we're a close-knit community, we provide hands-on learning and preparation for a changing world, for example. All these aphorisms, while they may be true, what you want is truth that is differentiated and can give you sort of a unique position in the mind of the audience. And so that sameness is a problem.
Yeah. And colleges, for the most part, they offer the same types of programs. I mean, when I take a look at most institutions, and when I think about a good example of branding, it's Unity Environmental University. It used to be Unity College. Their programs are completely focused on environmental studies, bachelor's, master's. They have unique ways of delivering. They have got an incredible story and they tell it really well. But not everybody's like that.
Yeah, so true. And by the way, I do love what Unity does. They have amazing brand message. They have amazing brand assets as well. Mm-hmm. And related to that, I think another problem is what you're alluding to there is branding treated as a visual exercise, right? That a logo is certainly an identifier, an important part of your brand, but the brand is more than that, right? It's an expectation. It's a promise to perform. And that's something that I think institutions really need to drill down on. You can't simply select an attractive adjective and declare that you own it, right? And furthermore, whatever you come up with truly has to be connected to the experience, right? So if the brand promises personal attention and the first interaction that a student has with your school is an unanswered email, the operational experience that they encounter defeats any promotion or communications that you've already put out there. A few other things are related to, an institution using insider speak, insider language, right? Mm-hmm. Students think differently from you, right? So you need a bit of empathy with the student mindset, right? Students think in terms of their own goals, their own anxieties, and trade-offs they're going to have to make in their life in order to be able to, attend your institution.
I've got a good example of this. Institutions talking about world-class research faculty. To your average undergraduate student, first off, they may say, "What is that?" And then second, you know, how does this help me? Rather than putting it in terms that students understand. World-class research faculty is great if you're going for a doctorate, if you're doing research, if you're postdoc, but for an undergraduate, not going to make much difference, is it?
Correct. And that's an example of putting an attribute out there instead of a benefit, right? So one of the core tenets of marketing is to lead with the benefit to the student rather than the owned attribute that you have. Mm-hmm. So it could be gain the opportunity to perform research with our world-class faculty. So it's a benefit to the student, right? And certainly that's the kind of thing that appeals to a certain demographic of student or a certain segment of the student population, the high achievers who have those levels of aspirations. So you got to think about where you're going to turn up the temperature. You may have all these brand attributes, but it's kind of like a equalizer for those of you who know like audio and you remember hi-fi's drum, right? Where we build our own equalizer.
No,
right?
that was way before my
So to visualize, you have the 50 hertz frequency on the left and you have the 2000 hertz on the right. And you controlled the sound based on these frequencies to your liking. So when you have a brand message, you want to tune the frequency to the audience, right? So you may drill down on academics, student experience. These are all different frequencies you have to tune into to different audiences. And of course, you have parental involvement. You have your surrounding community. Each one of those, audiences has a different relationship to. They're stakeholders in your brand, but with a different relationship. So you need to think about how those attributes relate to those audiences. So I think that's a great example.
Yeah. So you've got promise to perform, delivering on the mission. Your culture is also important as well, isn't it?
So if you asked anyone at Spark 451 about how we define brand, it's fairly simple. It's your promise plus your personality equals your brand, right? So it's what you provide and deliver is your promise, and your personality is your spirit or how you go about doing that. In the case of how we look at it from a totality, we think of there's 5 different buckets we want to look at. First is what you have, your infrastructure. What do you do? Your programs and services. How do you do it? What's your approach and process? Who do you have? That is your people, of course. And why you do it, your purpose, mission, and cause. All these things contribute to your brand. But I think when you kind of like pick out 2 of them and you find which ones are the most important to you and to your brand, you can lean into those to build a differentiated position. And that's what we look to accomplish when we're doing these types of brand studies with our university partners.
When we were talking last week, you had mentioned a great example of this mid-sized New York university.
Yes. So thank you for bringing that up. There was a mid-sized institution in New York that we went to and invited us in to do some work for them. And I think they had a really strong set of programs. They had a really beautiful campus. They had a nice student body, but they really didn't have a compelling story to tell. They had a lot of great things going on, but they didn't have a way of bringing it all together and unifying it. So we came upon this idea that they brought a balance to the student, right? They had strong academics, but they had lots of organized activities around relieving stress. They were focused on an academic success, but they also had lots of wellness programs in place, whole body wellness, emotional wellness, self-care. And then finally, they were really focused on affordability, and they put their money where their mouths were by doing a tuition reset and reducing their published tuition from $60,000 to mid $20,000 sticker price.
Wow, that's big.
Yeah. And their goal was to just sort of like remove that stress of affordability from their students. So a lot of it was built around balance. So we came up with this branding effort. We called them the Life Balance College. And it wound up being, very successful. We've had 2 great enrollment cycles with them. And it was the kind of thing that they were doing good things, but they did it in a good way to encompass it together. So it's been rolled out on their website, in some advertising campaigns, all their enrollment literature, all the enrollment materials that go out to students when they're on the road, beautiful brochures, etc., and manifest itself in a whole bunch of great creative deliverables. So, and it's something that they're comfortable delivering on, and something that students can expect that promise to be delivered on. So that's where it's strong.
Mm-hmm.
It's what we call a positioning, right? Positioning is that distinctive space you as an institution want to occupy in the audience's mind.
And we talk about this when we do planning with institutions. Positioning answers the question, what is the one thing that's unique, different, and better about us in the eyes of the customer versus the competition in the higher ed marketplace that has them hiring our graduates, wanting to attend our institution? That pretty much sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of putting it. It's, if you want to add another analogy to the equation, I think positioning is like picking a place on the map, right?
Yeah.
And brand is everything that makes people believe that you belong in that position, right? That positioning answers the question, why choose us? And the brand answers the question, what should be consistently expected from our institution? So they're related, but in some ways distinct from each other.
And it's not like you can just invent a brand. It is something that you have to think about, both internal and external, and look at it more holistically. Is that not correct?
100% true. And I think the way you discover your brand and your position, for that matter, is by beginning with what is true, not with what would look like, something attractive in a campaign. Ask questions like, why do students actually enroll here? Why do admitted students choose us over someone else? What do alumni say about us without being prompted? And I think the important thing that a lot of schools need to understand is that your brand exists whether or not you've formally defined it. That market out there has already positioned you. And if you engage in some brand research, it's going to tell you whether that position is valuable, accurate, or even changeable, right? And that's the thing. A good, strong brand is a positioning in the mind of your audience with attributes that they find valuable, right? They can have a brand. It could be a bad brand perception, but we want to make sure our perception is something that they find value in.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to that example that you just gave about the college and that whole, I call it whole life, but it's Life Balance College.
Yes.
They reduced the tuition. They changed their branding. What kind of results did they get?
So there's a lot of ways to measure results from a branding campaign. There's sort of the formal and the informal way. We are looking at enrollment results as our first KPI. And over the past 2 years, we have a 20% enrollment increase. Wow. So, that's from an institution that was struggling slightly. And that's, for us, a very strong result. And we're about sustainable enrollments. So it's Other industries might be used to massive growth from time to time, but enrollment in higher ed typically comes in and is best handled with sustainable growth. So, because it affects the total institution, right? So that's a big win for us. And so that's our first look, but there are other formal brand studies that we're planning. So this is going about doing brand perception studies, looking at general audience brand perception and doing some more formal surveying out there. So we have those types of things planned this year.
Mm-hmm. But even a 20% increase on enrollment is huge. And if the price is set properly to where it's a fair price and it eliminates the discounting, it should show up in bottom line revenues, I would think.
Absolutely. And, it comes down to, I think, one factor we would look at is net tuition revenue per student. So that's the comparative result you could look at across cycles, right? To say, like, if your institution is increasing in enrollment and the net tuition revenue per student is dropping, that's probably a bad sign.
Yes.
So we're always looking to manage that KPI.
This concludes part 1 of our talk on marketing and branding in higher education with our guest, Mike McGetrick. Tune in next week for part 2, where we're going to get much more in depth in enrollment marketing and the criticality of that for institutions.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.